For more than 5,000 years, 95% of Egypt's entire population has been squeezed into a narrow green ribbon running alongside the Nile, a strip of land making up barely 4% of the country's total territory. Everything beyond that ribbon, in every direction, is desert. Now imagine deliberately punching 170 kilometers of brand new river straight through the desert, entirely from scratch, carrying in enough water every single day to eventually turn an area larger than Lebanon into working farmland. That's not a thought experiment. On May 17th, 2026, Egypt's president formally inaugurated exactly that, a $15 billion megaproject its own government has started calling, quite literally, the New Nile. Here's what makes this genuinely strange, though. Egypt is one of the most water-stressed countries on the planet. It's currently locked in one of the tensest ongoing disputes over the Nile's water anywhere in Africa, following the completion of Ethiopia's colossal Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam far upstream. So how, exactly, does a country already worried about running out of water justify building an entirely new river to flood the desert with green farmland? And can it actually be done without draining resources the country genuinely cannot spare? With a population now approaching 120 million people, growing rapidly and largely still crammed into that same narrow band of land that has supported Egyptian civilization for millennia, the pressure behind this project is genuinely existential rather than purely economic. Egypt already imports somewhere between 12 and 13 million metric tons of wheat every single year, making it one of the largest wheat importers on Earth, a dependency that left the country badly exposed when global grain markets were rattled by the war in Ukraine and the disruptions of the COVID pandemic. Officials frame the new delta explicitly as a strategic response to exactly that kind of vulnerability, alongside the sheer demographic weight of trying to accommodate tens of millions more people inside a country where habitable land has barely expanded in generations. The scale of what's being attempted here is genuinely enormous. Officially named the New Delta Project, first announced back in 2018, the scheme aims to reclaim roughly 2.2 million feddans of desert, an area of around 9,000 square kilometers, and turn it into productive farmland. If Egypt manages to pull that off in full, it would expand the country's total cultivated land by more than a third, a genuinely staggering increase for a nation that's spent millennia confined almost entirely to the Nile's floodplain. Total investment in the project has already reached roughly 800 billion Egyptian pounds, somewhere around $15 billion, spent so far on preparing farmland, building grain silos, industrial zones, and new roads connecting these reclaimed desert areas back to the Nile Valley and the country's ports. At the heart of the entire scheme sits an almost bewilderingly complex water management system, because you can't simply grow wheat on sand. You first have to figure out how to move an enormous volume of water uphill across a genuinely vast distance into a region that has essentially never supported large-scale agriculture in recorded history. The project's centerpiece is a channel Egyptians have started nicknaming the artificial river, officially known as the Al-Hammam Canal, stretching roughly 170 kilometers through the western desert. Rather than simply diverting fresh Nile water directly into this canal, though not entirely, since a second track does draw some water straight from the river, the primary source feeding the system is something considerably less glamorous: agricultural drainage water. Water that's already been used once to irrigate farmland in the western Nile Delta, and which would otherwise simply be discharged straight out into the Mediterranean and lost for good, gets collected instead and sent to a treatment complex at Al-Hammam on the coast. There, in what's now considered the largest agricultural wastewater treatment plant anywhere on Earth, built at a cost of roughly 20 billion Egyptian pounds, up to 7.5 million cubic meters of water get treated every single day. From there, that treated water is pumped inland and westward, uphill through 13 separate pumping stations, climbing from low-lying drainage channels up onto the considerably higher desert plateau where the new farmland actually sits. A second, shorter track feeds additional flows into the system through its own set of large pumping stations, and together, engineers describe the whole network as comprising 19 principal pumping stations in total, fighting gravity every step of the way to push water somewhere it's never naturally reached before. A separate main pumping station alone, drawing water from Lake Nasser and feeding into the wider network via the Sheikh Zayed Canal, requires roughly 250 megawatts of power just on its own, giving some sense of just how much raw electrical muscle this entire system depends on around the clock. That's an extraordinarily energy-intensive way to move water, and Egyptian officials themselves have openly acknowledged it. During the project's inauguration ceremony, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi specifically urged government officials to properly explain the true costs involved to the Egyptian public, so citizens could genuinely appreciate the sheer scale of engineering effort and expense required to make water flow somewhere it would never naturally reach on its own. To help offset those enormous energy demands, the project has also folded in its own power generation infrastructure. with facilities designed to deliver a combined output of around 2,000 megawatts, specifically to keep those pumping stations running. From orbit, the results of all this effort are already strikingly visible. Satellite imagery of the Western Desert now shows large expanses of what used to be featureless sand transformed into distinctive green circles, the telltale signature of center pivot irrigation systems, machines that slowly rotate around a central pipe, spraying water outward in a perfect ring to create exactly that circular pattern from above. Hundreds of these green disks have already appeared scattered across the landscape in recent years, visible clearly enough that they've shown up in astronaut photography taken from the International Space Station. Neat green rings scattered across an otherwise unbroken expanse of brown sand for as far as the camera can see. For the Egyptian government, that visible transformation is presented as concrete proof the project is genuinely delivering results, turning empty desert into productive farmland focused primarily on wheat, corn, vegetables, and export-oriented crops like olives and figs, all aimed at reducing Egypt's heavy dependence on imported food and easing pressure on the country's foreign currency reserves. Officials point to figures showing thousands of square kilometers already brought under cultivation by the middle of this decade, as evidence the scheme is progressing well ahead of the skeptics who dismissed it as unrealistic when it was first announced back in 2018. But there's a considerably more complicated story sitting underneath those satellite images, and it starts with a genuinely important question. Where is all of this water actually coming from right now? Independent researchers analyzing the region have found that a significant share of the water currently irrigating these newly reclaimed fields isn't actually coming from the elaborate canal and treatment system at all. It's being pumped up from underground aquifers instead, ancient reserves of groundwater that accumulated over many thousands of years and simply cannot be meaningfully replenished on any timescale that matters to human planning. Satellite-based research tracking groundwater levels suggests depletion in parts of the Western Desert, including specifically in areas experiencing the heaviest reclamation activity, has been accelerating sharply over the past decade. Groundwater depletion is notoriously difficult to observe directly, unlike a green circle of crops that shows up instantly and unambiguously from orbit. A falling aquifer only reveals itself gradually, which is exactly why researchers increasingly rely on satellite gravity and elevation measurements just to detect it at all. In effect, some of that visible green abundance appearing across the desert right now may be less a genuinely renewable water source and more a form of spending down an ancient underground savings account that Egypt has no realistic way of refilling once it's gone. That groundwater problem sits alongside another, equally difficult one. Much of the Western Desert used to be seabed millions of years ago, which means the groundwater sitting beneath it today tends to be extremely salty, and the soil above it isn't naturally fertile either. Before crops like wheat can grow reliably in this ground at all, the land typically needs extensive chemical treatment and heavy fertilizer application, adding yet another significant ongoing cost, layered on top of everything already being spent on canals, pumping stations, and treatment plants. Engineers working on the ground have also run into hard, literal rock beneath the sand in places, complicating both the foundation work needed for new pumping infrastructure and any later attempts to drill down for supplementary groundwater. Then there's the genuinely uncomfortable geopolitical backdrop this entire project is unfolding against. Egypt depends on the Nile for the overwhelming majority of its fresh water, and for more than a decade, it has been locked in an increasingly tense dispute with Ethiopia over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, an enormous hydroelectric project built far upstream on the Blue Nile. Construction on that dam began back in 2011, and at one particularly heated point in 2019, tensions between the two countries escalated to the point where Ethiopia's own prime minister publicly suggested his country should be prepared to go to war over it. That dam, capable of holding back more than 70 billion cubic meters of water, roughly equivalent to an entire year's worth of the Nile's total flow, was formally inaugurated in September 2025, after roughly 14 years of construction, and it fundamentally alters the seasonal flow patterns Egypt has relied on for the entirety of its recorded history. Egyptian officials have spent years warning that any significant reduction in Nile flow reaching their own territory, particularly if it coincided with a prolonged regional drought that left both the Ethiopian dam and Egypt's own Aswan High Dam reservoir depleted simultaneously, could translate into agricultural losses, affecting as much as a third of the country's farmland in a single year. Building an entirely new river system that depends even partially on drawing water either directly from the Nile or from a groundwater supply that's already under mounting strain, all while locked in an unresolved standoff over the river's future flow, is precisely the kind of contradiction critics have seized on. Some analysts have gone so far as to describe the entire new Delta strategy as fundamentally at odds with Egypt's own repeated claims of severe water poverty on the international stage. There's also a sharper question buried inside what's actually being grown on all this newly reclaimed land, and who ultimately benefits from it. A meaningful share of production across the new delta's new farmland is focused specifically on higher value export crops, fruit, vegetables, and nuts, destined for international markets rather than staple grains meant to directly feed the domestic population. The government's argument is straightforward enough. That exporting these higher value crops generates foreign currency Egypt urgently needs to pay for the wheat and other staples it still has to import from elsewhere. Critics counter that this approach does surprisingly little to actually reduce Egypt's underlying dependence on volatile global food markets, potentially leaving the country's core food security challenge essentially unresolved even as the desert itself visibly turns green. None of this skepticism is coming out of nowhere either. Egypt has genuinely attempted something very much like this before. Back in the late 1990s, the Toshka project set out with strikingly similar ambitions, aiming to divert Nile water deep into the western desert to create an entirely new agricultural region from scratch, complete with its own promises of turning barren sand into a thriving second Nile valley. Despite years of substantial investment, Toshka fell dramatically short of its original targets, plagued by many of the same underlying challenges now facing the new delta, punishing costs, difficult soil, and a water supply that proved harder to sustain at scale than early projections suggested. It's frequently cited today as a cautionary tale for exactly this kind of desert reclamation megaproject, a reminder that impressive groundbreaking ceremonies and ambitious total acreage targets don't automatically translate into decades of productive, sustainable farmland. Transparency around the current effort hasn't made comparisons any easier to draw either. Detailed budgets for the new Delta scheme and its associated Future of Egypt program aren't published in Egypt's regular state budget documents, and much of the contracting work is handled through military-linked bodies, including the Future of Egypt Sustainable Development Authority and the Armed Forces Engineering Authority, rather than conventional civilian ministries, leaving independent analysts working with considerably less hard financial data than a project operating at this scale would normally generate. So where does that actually leave the new Delta project as of today? The concrete is unmistakably real. The pumping stations are real, the treatment plants are real and processing at a scale nobody else on Earth currently attempts for agricultural drainage water. The fields genuinely are turning green, visibly from space, exactly as promised. But the water genuinely keeping that transformation running today is, at least in significant part, coming from a source that cannot be replenished, inside a country already locked in an unresolved dispute over the river system it depends on for almost everything else. There's a meaningful distinction buried in that trade-off too. A cubic meter of water spent growing wheat buys calories that feed people directly. That same cubic meter spent growing export fruit buys foreign currency instead. Egypt genuinely needs both, but they aren't the same kind of security, and critics argue the new delta's current crop mix may be quietly prioritizing the second at the expense of the first. Egypt is essentially betting that this new agricultural frontier can be stabilized onto genuinely sustainable renewable water sources, primarily treated drainage water rather than finite groundwater, before those ancient aquifers run critically low. Whether that bet pays off, or whether the new delta eventually joins Toshka as another ambitious, expensive lesson in the genuine limits of turning desert into farmland, may end up being one of the defining infrastructure stories to watch across the entire region over the next decade. If you enjoyed this look at Egypt's audacious attempt to grow a second Nile delta out of the Sahara, make sure you're subscribed for more deep dives into the boldest, riskiest megaprojects being built around the world right now.